Good evening from Los Angeles. I'm Dan Rather, joining you this week from the Young Turks West Coast studios. We are now less than 1 month out from President Trump's self-imposed deadline to start deporting undocumented immigrants brought here as children. The deadline is using dreamers as ransom to force a broader immigration deal from Congress. Remember, Congress is not the pivot on which this all turns. Immigration, after all, was President Trump's signature issue on the campaign trail. It was Donald Trump's searing anti-immigrant venom that propelled him to the White House. And now this week is shaping up to be the culmination of the raging national battle he ignited. The fate of more than 2 million dreamers is at stake. The future of millions more undocumented immigrants. The hopes of untold millions around our globe, hoping one day to call America their home. All of it, the trajectory of all those lives, will be determined by whether President Trump will jettison his anti-immigrant political base. His official budget released today still calls for $18 billion for the wall, and his official immigration proposal last week called for $25 billion to pay for, quote, a border wall system. But we learned this weekend that at least some in the White House are open to compromise. The Los Angeles Times reported that White House officials are open to keeping immigration at its current levels, letting dreamers stay and clearing the backlog of undocumented immigrants seeking residency. In other words, a total betrayal of the xenophobia that gave Donald Trump the White House. Hypocrisy, but you might say it's of the very best kind. Whether President Trump will stick to this floated compromise, of course, should always be a cause for concern. But Republican leaders in Congress so far seem to be honoring their pledge to Democrats, a pledge for an open debate on immigration, not necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts. The party's business wing is eager for hardworking, low-paid labor, among other things. Their hope this week is that President Trump will not give in yet again to what they consider the small-minded fears of those who define America by skin color, language, and religion. Those who don't understand that what truly makes America great is not diminished, but made mighty as we increase our diversity. For all the noise and vitriol directed against immigrants, it turns out America has already come together on this very issue. Most Americans, including Republicans, already agree on immigration. Most of us want to open the doors of America to those who would be American. This week, we will see whether this Congress still understands the country it represents and what makes it great. The Defense Department is planning a national military parade at the request of the Commander-in-Chief. Yes, one of those breast-beating military show-offs we scoff at North Korea for holding for their maximum leader. The kind of thing that was a regular occurrence in the old Soviet Union and has long been associated with tin-horn dictators everywhere. We are still at war, and President Trump wants to hold a victory parade. American troops remain in harm's way, and the president wants us to celebrate. We can all agree America's armed forces deserve more recognition than they get, also better pay, education, and social services. But is this the way to do it? Seriously? For 17 years, American soldiers have fought for us as we move the goalposts on them. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, terrorism, evil itself. Those who serve honorably deserve to be honored, far above our poor power to do so. But remember, America's soldiers do get parades. Modest affairs usually, Main Street tributes to hometown heroes at times such as the 4th of July and Veterans Day. We know these parades are about their service because we can see their faces as they see ours. But what inspired President Trump's vision for a national extravaganza of a military parade? It was not the service of Americans in uniform. It was a French military parade he attended last year.
It was one of the greatest parades I've ever seen. It was 2 hours on the button, and it was military might, and I think a tremendous thing for France and for the spirit of France. And people don't know what great warriors they are in France, but when you see that and you see all the victories, it was a tremendous thing. And to a large extent, because of what I witnessed, we may do something like that.
He said he wanted, quote, to try to top it, unquote. And if you wonder who President Trump sees as the honoree in such events, consider what he wrote about that French parade. Congratulations, he wrote to President Emmanuel Macron. Congratulations, not to the troops, to the president. These parades dazzle us with gleaming machines, painting combat as kind of fun and exciting, turning soldiers invisible, camouflaging casualties and the savagery of war. They glorify only the military institution and whoever leads it. I know because I saw it firsthand in North Korea at a military parade in 2005. I have no desire to see it in America in 2018. Such a thing is not who we are and what we are. Past American presidents saw military power as a double-edged sword. Best to speak softly while you carry a big stick. Today, America has never possessed greater military might, but never has traditional military might seemed to matter less than against the foes we now face. And never have we turned our eye from the battlefield, as the president insists that we do now. Today, those who claim to support the troops do so against the backdrop of war zones we know little or nothing about, in countries we cannot name, for causes we cannot fathom. At a time when we grow ever more distant from the bloodshed in our name, more distant from our military history and tradition, from military families and veterans, we as a people have turned our backs on the front lines and hidden battlefields where our warriors fight and sometimes die. We do not demand answers for their deaths at sea, in Yemen or Niger. We little note the defeat of ISIS in Iraq. We do not mark the activation of the 1st Security Force Assistance Brigade at Fort Benning last week, bound for Afghanistan this spring. We do not hunt for news about U.S. troops taking fire last week in Syria. We turn our eyes and close our minds to the immense sacrifices of blood and treasure in wars without end. Forget about it. Just go to the mall and shop. Only a few politicians object to waging war in Syria and elsewhere without the congressional approval our Constitution demands. Even fewer voters care. So if our military have earned parades and more, the real question is, have we? How can we offer them a parade when we have yet to bring them home? By what right do we celebrate a military we ignore? To take pleasure in service we do not bother to follow, in sacrifice we do not share. By what right do we rejoice in victories about which we know nothing? And if we have not earned, if we do not deserve a national military parade, in what conceivable way has our president? A White House in chaos with women in the crosshairs. That's still ahead. Plus, the looting of Puerto Rico is now underway. So stay with us. It is the longest, biggest, worst blackout in American history, and it will not end soon. 400,000 people in Puerto Rico still have no electrical power, more than a quarter of the residents. Just last night, a substation blew, knocking out power for still more people. Last week's U.S. federal spending bill offered help. only a fraction of what Puerto Rico needs. Puerto Rico, in other words, remains on her knees, in the dark, suffocating under debt and austerity measures that predate Hurricane Maria. Wall Street descended on Puerto Rico well before the great hurricane, squeezing the island's investments in its people to win payoffs for investors. But there is still much of value in Puerto Rico, even after Maria. And disasters, as we all know, breed corruption and profiteering. The vultures can smell it, even in the dark. So now they're circling. And Puerto Rico, strapped for cash, honeycombed with corruption, is putting out welcome mats. The Commonwealth, in other words, is preparing to sell off what little remains of its commonwealth. Last month, Governor Ricardo Rosselló proposed selling off Puerto Rico's public power utility. With 22,000 students gone to the mainland U.S., maybe forever, the Puerto Rican government is also looking now at privatizing schools, including the University of Puerto Rico. But privatizing problems is no guarantee of solving them. Last week, we learned that FEMA paid a private contractor to provide 30 million meals for Puerto Ricans in need. But when the first delivery, 18 million meals, was due, only 50,000 showed up, and the packaging made them unfit to eat. It's a safe bet Wall Street will make money somehow if Puerto Rico privatizes power and education. Less certain, though, is whether it profits Puerto Rico's people. To keep track of that, the human margins, as they struggle to recover from the storm, we need good information, hard data. Who lives in the areas without power? What resources do they have? What do they need? Who needs help elsewhere? Puerto Rico collects that kind of vital information through the Institute of Statistics, information that is the functioning DNA of any responsive government, knowing its people, to serve its people. But now Puerto Rico's legislature is about to consider reorganizing the Institute of Statistics. And the data collection the Institute does will be privatized too. If it happens, then the information we and Puerto Rico needs to gauge the effect of profit motives on public service will now be in the hands of the private sector. The move has been opposed by 15 members of Congress and the American Statistical Association. Because Puerto Rico is vulnerable right now, and the scavengers are hoping to do their work out of sight, no one is watching, no one is counting, no one keeping track. In Puerto Rico, Wall Street, or Washington, thieves prefer to work in the dark. It's our job, our responsibility, to keep the power on and shine a light. Washington may be consumed with the fate of White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, but with or without him, the Trump administration still has a problem. Because the Rob Porter wife-beating scandal that has the White House under siege is a heat-seeking missile to the heart of many of President Trump's biggest fears and vulnerabilities. It reminds everyone that Mr. Trump, too, has been credibly accused of assault by multiple women. There have been several other people close to Trump accused of sexual and physical assault. There are dozens of people working in the White House still without full security clearances, including the president's son-in-law. A chief of staff who was brought in to create order is now spreading chaos. Mr. Trump's vow to bring in only, quote, the best people to work with him rings hollow, and his administration is having a tough time finding people to work in the White House. Meanwhile, the incredible cocoon of privilege and ego with which the president envelops himself blinds him to the sheer horror of his statements in defense of Mr. Porter. The president rails against the injustice of these accusations. This from a man who accused President Obama of being a foreigner. Mr. Trump talks about how, quote, people's lives are being shattered and destroyed by mere allegation. But he says nothing about the women victims. What about the lives of these women? Have they not been shattered and destroyed? And what about the lives of all of the women and men suffering in domestic violence situations? Mr. Trump once again proves he is indifferent to the fate of anyone other than himself. This is the low for this country that is nothing about politics. Listen, we can debate tax cuts and immigration policy and how we fund education. We can disagree about the size of our military or the best balance for protecting the environment. That is democracy. Debating whether credibly accused wife-beaters should be allowed the honor, and that's what it is, to serve in the White House isn't democracy. It's a kind of madness and a moment of sadness for the country. It's also a moment of fear for many young people, especially. My thoughts for them after this. Here's some other stories we're keeping an eye on and think you should. President Trump today finally unleashed his 10-year, $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan to fix the nation's crumbling highways and bridges and largely ignore mass transit. The plan calls for the feds to put up $200 billion. The rest, the White House says, it hopes will come from states and cities. But folks, it's an election year and Congress may be reluctant to pass anything that costs this much. So infrastructure may have to wait. Although President Trump is planning to stop funding the International Space Station, the Washington Post reports today's new budget calls for $150 million to save it. How? By using that money to transition the space station away from government control and into corporate hands. The plan does not say why the private sector might want a space station, except to speculate that its future landlord could someday charge NASA rent as, quote, one of many customers, unquote. Israel today said it will continue to carry out military strikes in Syria after a weekend in which Israel lost its first fighter jet to enemy fire in decades. It began with an Iranian drone crossing from Syria into Israel airspace, a charge Iran denies. From there, the thing escalated rapidly, with Syrian fire taking down an Israeli F-16 and Israel claiming to take out half of Syria's air defenses in response. Although ISIS is fading, the growing presence of international players in Syria is eye-opening. Russia, Iran, Turkey, the United States. This is no longer a pressure cooker, folks. It's a time bomb, with precious little being done to defuse it. Purdue Pharma, the company that brought us OxyContin, says it will stop pushing the painkiller to doctors. The company is being sued by states and local governments for igniting the opioid epidemic by engineering painkillers patients would come to need. In 2016, opioids killed an estimated 53,000 people, 72% of those using prescription drugs. President Trump has followed up on a few of the recommendations made by the committee he put together on opioid abuse. He said last week his approach to get really tough with drug dealers is proceeding. On Friday, we should note, President Trump nominated Jim Carroll as America's next drug czar, heading up the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Carroll's resume does not include any public health experience. The White House says he dealt with drug-related issues as a prosecutor in Virginia. In closing, this is personal, as it often is with the work I'm trying to do now. That work is trying to provide a steady, reliable, experienced voice of reason to events in our country and, for that matter, in the world. The effort includes trying to put what's happening into some context and perspective, especially historical perspective. I haven't been everywhere and done everything, not nearly. But now, 86 years old and a working reporter for almost 70 of those years, I have been a lot of places, covered a lot of stories, and a fair amount of history. That doesn't make me an expert on anything. It may help a little in the effort to contribute some context and perspective. I have no illusions. Mine is a small, really microscopic effort. And I'm bound to fail some, if not a lot of the time, bound to make mistakes and misjudgments. With all that in mind, let me leave you tonight with this. There's a new book out titled How Democracies Die. It suggests that our way of life may now be dying at the hands of authoritarianism, which could easily slide into extreme nationalism, perhaps even fascism. Several young people, both in their early 20s, stopped me in airports this past weekend to say, I'm paraphrasing here, Mr. Rather, we're scared, downright frightened with what's happening in our country and to our government. Is this the beginning of the end of America as we and our forebears have known it? Is this how democracy ends? To which I respectfully now submit an answer. No. We as a people, as a society, as a nation, as a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy are not falling apart at the seams or crumbling. We are going through a particularly perilous period in our history, with anti-democratic trends increasing not only in our own country, but in many places around the world. Whether this trend continues to grow or abates or withers away in the United States depends on how a majority of citizens respond now and in the months and years ahead. If enough citizens reject the current authoritarian assault on our institutions, then the tide will turn. The ballot box will be the ultimate decider. Fear can be exploited and is being exploited rather successfully now by the forces of authoritarianism. But fear can be a great motivator for citizens who are opposed. For all of those Americans, young and not so young, who are fearful that our democratic system is near the end, a gentle suggestion. If you don't like who is in power and what they're doing, don't fret, don't dither, or descend into defeatism. Take heart. Get busy. Be active. Organize. There is a great battle underway for the soul of our country. Whatever side you're on, this is not a fight any of us should sit out. This is the moment, now is the hour, to stand and be counted. With that, I'll leave you for this news cycle. The Young Turks is next, and we'll be back with the news at this same place and time, 5:30 Eastern, every Monday. Until next Monday, Dan Rather reporting. Stay steady. And now, here is the Young Turk himself, Dink Ogura. Dink, what do you got for us tonight?
Well, we've got an amazing and excellent show, but I want to say it is an absolute pleasure and honor to have you as part of the network and here in our studio.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that.
Now, how are you liking the show so far?
You know, I love doing the show. It's a challenge. It's something new. We're feeling our way. We're going to get better. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Well, I don't know how you can get better because I love the show. Can't wait to listen to it every week and watch it every week. So thank you for being a part of the network. I really appreciate it.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, Jim.
All right, wonderful.
Thanks, my friend.
Okay, and the Young Turks starts right now.